I'm sorry, gentlemen, but some things simply shouldn't exist. Your son is a mistake of nature. The voice of the director, Mr. Laurent, was calm, almost surgical, which made it even more brutal. The words hung in the sterile room, sucking all the air out of it. André felt his wife Inez tremble in his hand. At that moment, time split in two. Before, when there was still hope at that school, and after, when all that remained was the echo of that cruelty. 17 days. That was the time. Between the sentence that condemned his son, Oscar, and the moment when Mr. Laurent, standing on the stage of the school auditorium, would see his whole world collapse, piece by piece, before the eyes of all the parents who once admired him. Where are you watching us from? Tell us in the comments. If you believe that justice is sometimes slow but never fails, and that the voices of those who are not heard can become thunder, sign up. The story of how a mistake of nature corrected the course of destiny is just beginning. The principal's office door closed behind them, but the sound of the words continued to echo inside André's head. Mistake of nature. The phrase was poison spreading through his veins, paralyzing him. He looked at Inez, whose face was pale as marble, her eyes fixed on a point ahead, as if trying to dissociate herself from reality. And then he looked at Oscar. The 10-year-old boy, who was sitting on a chair in the hallway, hadn't heard the words, but he could feel the emotional storm emanating from his parents. He began to swing his legs rapidly, an anxious rhythm that was his way of coping with the invisible chaos. The walk to the car was the longest of their lives. The silence was like a leaden weight. André wanted to scream, wanted to go back into that room and smash everything, wanted to make Mr. Laurent swallow every poisonous syllable, but he did nothing. He just got into the car, gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, and took a deep breath, trying not to break down in front of his son. It was at home that the dam broke. As soon as Oscar went to his room, to his sanctuary of Legos and astronomy books, Inez collapsed on the sofa, crying in violent, silent waves. André paced back and forth in the living room, rage and pain fighting for space inside him. How dare he repeated, more to himself than to his wife. How can a man charged with educating children harbor so much hatred in his heart? That man, the headmaster of the prestigious Pemberton Academy, had not only insulted his son, he had invalidated every struggle, every achievement, every moment of joy. He had taken the unique and complex universe that was Oscar and reduced it to a mistake. The pain was so deep because it came from a place that was supposed to be safe. They had trusted that school, that principal. They had given him the most precious thing in the world, and he had spat on it. André's outburst that night was not made up of screams, but of a cold decision that formed in the midst of his anger. He sat down at his old desk, turned on the computer, and began to write. He described the meeting in minute detail: the office decor, the principal's expensive suit, his condescending smile, the exact phrase. He wrote about Oscar's expression in the hallway, about Inez's tears. He wrote not because he had a plan, but because he needed to get the poison out of him. He felt that if he didn't, it would consume him. He was alone, betrayed, his heart broken by the cruelty of the world. But as his fingers flew over the keyboard, a spark of something new began to burn beneath the pain. It was determination. He didn't know how, but he knew he wouldn't let it go. That man had judged his son. Now the world would judge him. The irony was that Pemberton Academy had been presented to them as the promised land. Just 6 months earlier, André and Inez had sat in the same auditorium where the final drama would unfold, listening to the same Mr. Laurent sell them a dream. And they had bought every word. The school had an impeccable reputation, glossy brochures, and a waiting list that was years long. Mr. Laurent, with his polished charisma and his talk of holistic education, seemed like the answer to all their prayers. Here at Pemberton, he said on the day of the admissions interview, we don't see labels, we see potential. We believe that every child is a unique flame, and our job is to provide the oxygen for it to shine. He looked directly at Oscar, who was standing quietly in a corner studying the patterns on the carpet, and smiled. We want children who think outside the box. We want the dreamers, the artists, the future innovators. To André and Inez, who were coming from a frustrating experience at a public school that simply didn't have the resources to support Oscar. It sounded like music. They invested their savings, moved closer to campus, and reorganized their lives around that promise. Hope was palpable, a bright balloon they held tightly. The first signs that something was wrong were subtle, easy to ignore. They were small cracks in the perfect facade. Oscar's teacher, a young woman named Ms. Anya, seemed genuinely interested at first, but her communications became increasingly tense. "Oscar has difficulty keeping up with the group," one email said. "He gets distracted during group activities," said another. The language was always corporate, focused on performance and metrics, never on Oscar's happiness or well-being. The pressure for him to fit in was relentless but disguised as encouragement. They forced him to participate in a play despite his stage fright, calling it an exercise to get out of his comfort zone. They criticized his intense interest in old maps, suggesting he should focus on more social activities. The single flame that Mr. Laurent had promised to nurture was being systematically smothered by a fire extinguisher of conformity. The false hope reached its peak 2 weeks before the fateful meeting. The school held a science fair, and Oscar, with Andre's help, built an incredibly detailed model of the ancient Roman aqueduct system, his latest obsession. He spent weeks on the project, and the result was a work of art. On the day of the fair, Mr. Laurent walked by his table, took a cursory glance, and said, "Interesting, but this year's prize went to a team solar energy project. Collaboration is the key to the future, Oscar." He didn't even wait for a response. It was the accumulation of these small rejections, this constant pressure, that led to the meeting. They requested it to discuss how the school could really support Oscar, to rekindle the initial promise. They entered that room filled with nervous hope, expecting a constructive dialogue. Instead, they found a judge ready to deliver his sentence. The phrase "mistake of nature" was not a slip of the tongue. It was the logical conclusion of a school philosophy that saw any deviation from the norm not as diversity, but as a defect. The bright balloon of hope did not just deflate. It was popped with the sharpest, cruelest needle they had ever encountered. Mr. Jean-Pierre Laurent was not a villain by birth. He was the sculpture of his own ambitions and of a system that rewarded him for his rigidity. To understand why he uttered such cruel words, one had to dig into the layers of his personal history, where success had always been synonymous with measurable perfection. Laurent came from a family of academics in Strasbourg, where excellence was not a goal, but the baseline. His father, a renowned surgeon, and his mother, a concert pianist, raised him in a high-pressure environment where every wrong note, every hesitation, was seen as a character flaw. He learned early on that a person's value was in their results, their trophies, their ability to outperform others. There was no room for process or individuality. There was only the podium. When he became an educator, he took that philosophy with him. He wasn't a sadist who enjoyed seeing children suffer. In his mind, he was preparing them for the real world, a place he saw as a relentless competition. Pemberton Academy was his masterpiece, a well-oiled machine designed to produce winners. The high tuition fees, the elite reputation, the alumni at prestigious universities, all of this fueled his sense of purpose and validated his methods. Conflict with Oscar was inevitable. Oscar was, at his core, immeasurable by Laurent's standards. His genius didn't translate into perfect grades in every subject. His progress couldn't be plotted on a quarterly performance chart. His quiet refusal to participate in activities that didn't make sense to him was, to Laurent, an act of insubordination, a grain of sand in the gears of his perfect machine. He saw Andre and Inez's dedication not as parental love, but as an attempt to justify mediocrity. Oscar represented everything Laurent had been taught to fear and despise in himself: vulnerability, nonconformity, failure to meet external expectations. Every time he saw the boy absorbed in his maps, ignoring the competitive chaos around him, it was a reminder of a path he could never follow. His anger was not only directed at the boy, it was a projection of his own insecurity, of his own gilded prison. The phrase "mistake of nature" was the culmination of his frustration. In that room, confronted with the parents' insistence on celebrating the individuality he saw as a flaw, his armor cracked. For a moment, the polished principle disappeared, and what remained was the frightened boy from Strasbourg, repeating the cruel lesson he had learned long ago. If something doesn't fit the standard of excellence, it's a mistake. He wasn't just expelling Oscar from his school, he was trying to exorcise a ghost from his own past. The human conflict was this: a broken man, terrified by the idea that the success he had pursued all his life could actually be an empty form of failure, and Oscar, without saying a word, was the mirror that reflected this unbearable truth. The night Andre started writing was the first night of the turning point. He didn't know it, but by turning his pain into data, he was forging a weapon. He created a password-protected blog called The Echo of Pemberton. The name was a reference to the echo of the principal's words that haunted his mind. Initially, it was just a diary, a place to document everything so that he and Inez wouldn't start to doubt their own sanity. He recorded the conversation, the dates, Mrs. Anya's previous emails, the incident at the science fair. He was methodical, almost obsessive. In the early days, the blog was his only confidant. Inez was focused on creating a safe bubble for Oscar, who, sensing the tension, had withdrawn even further. The turning point, the moment when loneliness turned into action, came unexpectedly. Andre, in an act of desperation and curiosity, began searching for Mr. Laurent's name along with the gyms, looking for any complaints, any other stories. He found an old parent forum, most of the posts years old. He wrote a vague post. Has anyone else had complicated experiences with the Pemberton administration? For 3 days, there was no response. He was about to give up when a notification arrived, a private message. It was from a woman named Katerina. The message was short. Complicated is an understatement. My son studied there for 2 years. We had to take him out. Do you have time for coffee? The meeting was clandestine, in a coffee shop far from the school neighborhood. Katerina was a lawyer, with a sharp gaze and a calmness that contrasted with Andre's turbulence. She told him her story. Her son, who had dyslexia, was labeled lazy and unmotivated by the same Mr. Laurent, until his mental health began to deteriorate. They took him out before the damage was irreparable. Andre, feeling an immediate connection, showed her the blog. As Katerina read, her expression changed from empathy to focused intensity. This is more than a diary, Andre, she said, pointing to the laptop screen. This is a dossier. It's a pattern of behavior. Systematic discrimination under the guise of high standards. The silent turning point was this joining of forces. Andre's pain provided the raw material. Katerina's legal experience provided the structure. She advised him not to seek revenge, but justice. Anger makes you make mistakes, she said. Documentation gives you power. She helped him refine his blog, organize his evidence, and focus on the facts. And through her contacts, she found 2 other families who had been through similar situations. One had a son with ADHD, the other a daughter who suffered from severe anxiety. All had been pushed out of school in subtle and cruel ways. The plan began to take shape, not in a war room, but over coffee tables and late-night email exchanges. They wouldn't go to the press. They wouldn't file a lawsuit right away. They would use Laurent's own system against him. The next parent-teacher conference was scheduled for 9 days later. It would be on his stage, in his auditorium, in front of the audience he worked so hard to impress. The turnaround would not be a bang, but the sound of many silent voices coming together to finally speak the truth. The period leading up to the parent-teacher meeting was a race against time, marked by a series of small victories that fueled the group's hope. Each new discovery, each new ally, was another brick in the fortress they were building around their truths. Revenge, which had once been an amorphous and furious desire in Andre's heart, was turning into a precise strategy, driven by a community. The first victory was the email. Katerina, using her lawyer's acumen, suggested that Andre send a formal, carefully worded email to Mr. Laurent and the school board, requesting Oscar's complete academic record and all official communications regarding his performance. It was a standard bureaucratic request. The response, as expected, was a polite and evasive email from the principal, downplaying the concerns and promising future synergy. But what he didn't know was that one of the other mothers in the group, who worked in IT, was able to analyze the email's metadata. The analysis revealed that Andre's email had been forwarded by Laurent to the school's lawyer within minutes of receiving it, with a short note. Deal with this. Risk of litigation. That little sentence was gold. It proved that Laurent knew his conduct was problematic and was more concerned with protecting himself legally than resolving the situation. It was the first concrete evidence of his bad faith. The second victory was Mrs. Anya. Oscar's young teacher had clearly been unhappy for months. One of the mothers in the group, who was a psychologist, ran into her by chance at a supermarket. Instead of confronting her, she offered empathy. "It must be so hard to work under so much pressure," she said. "The focus on results must be exhausting." Those words opened a small crack in the teacher's loyalty. 2 days later, an anonymous envelope appeared in André's mailbox. Inside were copies of internal memos from Mr. Laurent to the staff, with phrases highlighted such as, "Identify and manage underperforming students who affect our metrics," and "Optimize our student population to maintain our reputation for excellence." It was discriminatory policy, black on white. The teacher did not identify herself, but her contribution was an act of quiet courage. The third, and perhaps most significant victory, was over Oscar himself. André and Inez, now working as a team, explained to him in simple terms that they were leaving Pemberton because it wasn't a good place for him. They didn't use hateful words. They said they were looking for a school that would love his maps and his incredible brain. One evening, Oscar approached André while he was working on the dossier. He pointed to the screen and said, "Is this about the sad man?" André, surprised, asked who he meant. "The principal," Oscar replied. "His eyes are sad." That observation, coming from his son who was supposedly incapable of perceiving social nuances, was a revelation. Oscar didn't see a monster. He saw an unhappy man. At that moment, André realized that the fight was not just to punish Laurent, but to protect his son's kind and perceptive world. Victory was keeping that kindness intact. Each of these achievements was a step forward. The email was the proof. The memos were the motive. Oscar's perception was the cause. The group of parents, which now included 5 families, was no longer a gathering of victims. They were a task force, each contributing their skills, united by a common purpose. Mr. Laurent's downfall would not be an act of revenge, but the inevitable consequence of the truth coming to light. The night before the parent-teacher meeting, with the dossier complete and the plan of action laid out, André found himself in a rare moment of silence. Oscar slept peacefully, for the first time in weeks, and Inez, exhausted but resolute, rested beside him. André went to the living room, where Oscar's model of the aqueducts was still assembled, a silent and resilient work of art. Looking at it, he reflected on the dizzying journey of the past 16 days. What had started as an explosion of anger and a primal desire for revenge had morphed into something he barely recognized. The initial image in his mind was to humiliate Mr. Laurent, to make him feel the same pain and helplessness that he and his family had felt. But along the way, the I gave way to we. André's lonely pain found an echo in Katerina's story, and then in that of other families. He realized that the problem was not just a cruel phrase uttered in a closed room. The problem was a culture, a system that silently discarded children who did not fit into a prefabricated mold of success. His fight was no longer about his family's wounded honor, but about the safety of all children, present and future, who might walk through those doors. The file on his computer was no longer a weapon of revenge, but a tool for change. The goal was no longer just the downfall of one man, but the rebuilding of a community. He thought of Oscar's perception, the sad man. Those words haunted him. Behind Laurent's arrogance and cruelty was a poverty of spirit that his own son, the mistake of nature, was able to see. Laurent was trapped in a cage of expectations and metrics, a prison he had built himself and now imposed on others. The real victory, André understood, would not be to see Laurent destroyed, but to see the culture of his prison dismantled. It would be to ensure that Pemberton became a place that celebrated aqueduct builders as much as science fair winners. The deepest reflection was about himself. Before that incident, he was a loving but passive father. He trusted the experts, the elite school principals, the glossy brochures. He believed his role was to work hard to pay the tuition and hope for the best. Laurent's insult, painful as it was, woke him up. It forced him to become a researcher, an organizer, an advocate. He found a strength he didn't know he had, not in spite of his love for Oscar, but because of him. The boy the world saw as disabled had been the catalyst that made his father powerful. Andre understood that the next day's event was not the end of a battle, but the beginning of a new way of positioning himself in the world. Revenge is a fire that consumes everything and leaves nothing behind. Justice, he now saw, was an act of gardening, pulling out the weeds so that new and better things could grow, and he was ready to plant. The Pemberton Academy auditorium was packed. The air conditioning hummed, but the atmosphere was charged with tense anticipation. On stage, under the bright lights, Mr. Laurent was in his element. He spoke with his usual confidence about the successes of the last semester and the goals for the next, using his corporate jargon of excellence and global leadership. He was the conductor of his successful orchestra. The moment came during the question and answer period. As agreed, Katerina stood up first. With the calmness of a lawyer in court, she did not make an accusation. She asked a question. Mr. Laurent, could you explain to the board and parents the school's policy regarding students with neurodivergences, such as dyslexia, and why at least 3 families with dyslexic children have left the school in the last 2 years after being labeled uncooperative? Laurent, taken aback, stammered out a rehearsed response about individualized support plans. Before he could catch his breath, another parent stood up. What about the pressure to optimize the student population, as mentioned in your internal memos? Could you explain what that means? He projected a copy of the memo, obtained by Ms. Anya, onto the large screen behind Laurent. A murmur rippled through the auditorium. Then it was Andre's turn. He didn't stand up to attack. He stood up and, in a steady voice, told his story. He didn't use adjectives, just facts. He described the meeting, the day, the time, and then he uttered the phrase. At the end of the meeting, Mr. Laurent informed us that our son, Oscar, was, and I quote, a mistake of nature. A shocked silence fell over the auditorium. It was one thing to read about mismanagement in a memo. It was quite another to hear the raw cruelty of it. Laurent turned white. He looked at the board, sitting in the front row, and saw their faces turn into masks of horror and fury. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. His reputation, built over decades, evaporated under the stage lights in less than 5 minutes. He lost everything. His credibility, his job, his image. And all of this happened in front of the parents who once idolized him and now looked at him with contempt. The real hope, however, did not come from Laurent's downfall. It came from what happened next. In the weeks that followed, the group of parents, led by Katerina and Andre, did not disperse. They worked with the board to reform school policy. They helped hire a new principal, an educator who came from an inclusive school. They created a parent committee for diversity and inclusion. The final scene is not Laurent's humiliation, but an image that occurred a few months later. It is a Saturday morning at Pemberton, now under new management. There is an interests fair where each child can present what they love. At one table, Oscar, standing next to his model of the aqueducts, enthusiastically explains Roman engineering to a group of genuinely fascinated parents and children. Andre and Inez watch him from a distance, not as anxious guardians, but as proud spectators. The truth is that the pain of that insult will never completely disappear, but it has been transformed into a foundation, the foundation of a better school and a stronger community, built on the ruins of one man's intolerance. Words can build empires, but they can also tear them down. No wall is high enough to contain the truth when many voices decide to speak out. If this story of justice and community has inspired you, show your support. Like, comment with your own experience or a word of encouragement, and subscribe to the channel. You never know who might need to hear that they are not alone, and that change is possible. Your interaction makes this message echo further.